All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the South Florida Arboriculture and Landscape Professional webinar series. Um, I'm going to go ahead. I see there's quite a few people still percolating in, and I'll keep monitoring that and letting everybody that's coming into the waiting room as shuttling them through. With that said, we've got today our speaker is Andrew Koeser. He's from the Environmental Horticulture Department in the Gulf Coast Research Education Center. Uh, uh, and so up towards Tampa is where he works out of. And today, yeah, and he's very involved with the Florida chapter ISA as well. And so today he's going to talk to us about a very always timely topic, anything storm related, but dealing with the aftermath of storms. So with that, I'll go ahead and just pass it off here to Andrew.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thanks for having me today. I gave this talk 2 days ago in Wisconsin, and it was nowhere near as nice as the weather we have here, even on a cool day. It was -3 when I was up there, which is the weather's trying to kill you when you're in that kind of conditions. So we have hurricanes like maybe once or twice a year for one terrible day. They have winter for like 6 months. So, as you can see here, this is a slide set that Ed Gilman put together. This came around in like the 2005 hurricane season, and the Forest Service asked me to kind of look at it again, a few years ago. So I just want to give credit to Ed and his team for working on it. And then I'll give you my take in the next few slides. So often a lot of trees in Florida, they get the majority of their pruning from the wind and afterwards in our restoration efforts. Cities up north, they tend to have like a 3-year pruning cycle for every city in their city, or like a 5-year pruning cycle, or maybe even a 7 if the budgets are low. Where we're doing a lot of hazard mitigation, risk mitigation, and restoration work down here in Florida. Um, so with that in mind, this talk will kind of give you a walkthrough of kind of the initial response, what you're supposed to do right after the storm, and then how to formulate a plan for getting a tree back up to its former glory if it is salvageable. And we'll give you some guide back or feedback on what trees can be saved and which trees probably just need to be removed, and a lot of trees can be saved. And so, I know there's like a race in recovery to get as many things down for FEMA funding and things like that. But there are resources out there, including the Forest Service has strike teams to help you assess what trees can make it in the future. And then as tree care professionals, you can be doing this work for your customers as well, knowing that they will never get a mature tree back on their property if you have to remove it. So, not in their lifetime at least. So, here we go. We're going to go through rebuilding after the storm, restoration pruning for storm damaged trees. So, stress finds a weak point. This is, trees bend and twist in the wind, and they are quite resilient. These are some live oak that were planted up in Gainesville, and there is a turboprop array of I think four independently oscillating fans off camera that are blowing this down. And you can see that this tree is bending away from the wind, and it has significant taper in its trunk. It's thickest at the bottom because the more wood you have, the more you're able to distribute load from wind and other forces like gravity. So this it has almost like a teardrop shape because you have thinner branches at the top, increasing mass as you go further along, distributing that load. And when things are perfectly in sync, that load is completely distributed and there's no breaking point, and the tree is able to weather the storm. Though even a very sound tree, such as this young live oak, will have its limit if winds get excessively intense, like in a category 4 or 5 storm, right? But older trees and bigger trees have many more opportunities for there to be a break in their stress pathway, a weak point. So as the load travels down the branches, you can see here it's making its way from the very tips of the branches towards the inner trunk. You can run into all sorts of things. Um, moving on to this union here, you could have, a high aspect ratio branch union. So when we talk about aspect ratio, we talk about the diameter of the branch like the lateral branch that's attached to the main stem or the main branch. And as you approach a 1 to 1 or an aspect ratio of one, because one divided by one is one, right? You are almost perfect codominance, where you have equal sized limbs emerging from one point. When you have perfect codominance, where you have 1 to 1, a 1 to 1 ratio, or even close approaching that, you have less of that traditional trunk wood grasping onto branch wood, kind of overlapping that we saw in like those Shigo explosive diagrams, where you see just growth after growth, year after year, kind of interlocking into almost a lag kind of threading pattern. Well, as you get to this 1 to 1, you just have essentially two stems mashing up against each other. There can be some intermingling of the fibers at the union, but it is also a weaker branch attachment than something with maybe like a with the branch is a third the size of the main parent stem that's attached to, right? If that's not the part that breaks, and often the codominant branches don't break. Most trees have codominant branches, and most codominants make it fine throughout the storm. We just tend to see the ones that fail because we're keyed into them. But as you move along, you could come into another weakness. So this could be, and this is one that is very significant, right? In my research, we've looked at what makes certain trees fail in storms, and we did a global review of the literature and past wounds, past wounds. So if we had to do kind of a large removal of a limb, maybe the limb was facing downward, it was obstructing traffic, we let it get along too far, and it was a pretty sizable limb. We're cutting into heartwood. That past wound can be a weak spot. Even with closure, there could be discoloration and decay behind the wound. So whenever we prune trees, we need to be aware that we are wounding the tree, and there are tradebacks. You have to do what you have to do to clear roadways and to clear roof lines and things like that. But the smaller the wound, the better when it comes to reducing breakage. And then, maybe it gets past that. Maybe that wasn't the weakest point. Maybe, so you pass the codominant, the 1 to 1 ratio, you pass the old wound, but, further along in that branch, there could be another opportunity for failure, such as the branch union itself, the main branch, with the trunk. You can see in this case, it could have been a codominant stem. This was three codominant stems emerging from one point. And you can see here there was um, included bark, which prevented any intermingling of fibers, any connections between the stems, and you have compression and pressure that are flattening the sides of those stems, making them less than a perfect cylindrical form, which would be a stronger form. So, you know, uh, and if that was enough, if that wasn't enough to break, and because there's even a lot of codominance in the upper crown like that still make it. You can see here this tree has codominance and they didn't break. The stress moves downward into the trunk where there could be hollows that could weaken it, or it moves to the roots. So once it goes to the roots, there could be either root defects or soil defects, such as saturation, that can lead a tree to topple over. After Milton here in St. Petersburg, I didn't see a lot of root defects. I didn't see a lot of roots snapping like you see here. I saw a lot of soil failure, and the difference being that the soil saturated to the point where it just became slippery. There was nothing for the ropey, longer supporting roots to grab onto. Those things kind of anchor in like guy wires underneath the soil surface, and they just pulled out. The whole thing slipped loose, and you could see the ends of the roots kind of poking through as the tree dug itself out of the ground there. I'll show you a picture of that in a little bit. So, Root failure, root decay. I don't know why this lady is so happy to be next to this fallen tree, but maybe she's just trying to avoid getting poked in the eye with the roots. But this is root failure where you can see decay and breakage closer to the trunk, right? That's a sign that there was something going on, or maybe you could even have like oftentimes sidewalk or roadway repair close to the trunk will lead to that decay, or and you'll see like a bunch of roots growing off of the cut ends that may give way. Whereas a soil failure much further out, you have a much larger root plate. You can see this had a really shallow or a high water table, shallow root system, and roots further away that are kind of ropier, not so much structural roots, more guy wire roots, were pulled out of the ground and kind of just pancaked up. Actually, they're ripped straight up and flopped over. So that's a soil failure. Again, that had more to do with the soil being waterlogged than to any kind of um, issue with roots whatsoever. So nothing you can really do in that case. Um, but if you alter drainage in a site, as you're developing stuff, you can alter it in a negative way and have this be more likely to occur for existing trees on site. Tree failures in natural forests. We tend to see trees in natural forests not have a lot of codominant branches. The most limiting aspect of growth in the forest that has a close canopy like this is light. So growth is pretty much forced straight upward towards any gaps that have emerged in the canopy. And once a tree gets dominance in the landscape and has a dominant canopy, then it can kind of branch out and have more structure. But until then, everything's kind of going straight up, right? And especially like oaks, they can have a very plastic shape where they get really wide and broad in like a savanna setting, but in the forest they have this very X-current shape. Cypresses, on the other hand, where they're going to behave that way either way, whether they're in the landscape by themselves or in a hammock or a grove like this, um, just because they have really strong hormonal control of their growth and they really stay up and down like a Christmas tree, that X current form, unless something breaks the terminal branch at the top. The most common way that branches fail in this scenario where you're getting shaded out is just by not keeping up. So every branch on a tree is in it for themselves, right? So branches need to support both themselves and then hopefully they have enough photosynthate left, enough stored energy left after they've supported themselves to pass more to the trunk, right? And then that passes downward to the roots and other parts of the tree that don't produce their own sugars. But if a branch is shaded out by its peers above, there's no love for that branch. The tree is not maintaining that. It'll just let it die. If the branch can't maintain itself, it'll eventually just, slow down its growth, lose its foliage, and become a stub, like you see here. And this is something we try to mimic in our pruning. So we don't when you have a codominant stem that has full light, there might be that temptation to just cut off the entire branch. But when you do that, you create a large wound in comparison to the trunk that's attached to. Because remember, codominant stems have an aspect ratio that nears 1 to 1, or maybe it's 0.7, so it's like 70% of the size of the stem that is attached to. That's a big wound. But when these branches have a chance to slowly die back and kind of grind to a halt, by the time they finally die and break off, they're much smaller than the parent stem, just because the parent stem keeps growing from all the photosynthate is getting above and beyond that branch, right? So then we have these stems that break off, like right here, and this is a much smaller wound that'll eventually kind of pop out or be fully engulfed eventually by stem. And that is a much more ideal situation. So we do that with our reduction pruning. We pick, instead of doing a removal right away, a removal cut, we do reduction pruning where we essentially hobble the branch. We cut back its photosynthetic area, which is the same thing as kind of shading it out. And we let that branch persist while the rest of the tree grows to eventually where it gets to the point where it's similar ratio like this. So if that makes sense. So we're mimicking nature with our reduction pruning. And so because trees have this kind of excurrent shape that we see here, in forests, often we don't see that stress pathway where branches are breaking, right? Because there's that dominant kind of shape where the stem is the main thing, and all the lateral branches are kind of small and strongly attached, right? So when we do see breakages in forest environments, we often see stem breakage, especially if this was a stand that was protected by an outer edge and that edge of trees toppled over. Now these trees that have never been exposed to wind will start to snap, and that's devastating. Or we see whole root failure for like more dominant species in the landscape that have an exposed canopy. Things will just kind of topple over, and that creates a gap for trees to grow into the newly exposed light. Urban areas, whole tree failures are quite rare, right? This is from Hurricane Matthew, which was a tropical storm by the time it hit these trees in Charleston and Savannah. It was tropical storm winds, 93%, the vast majority of trees, and this is things that we don't focus on. 93% of the trees in tropical storm winds had no damage whatsoever out of like 1,600 trees. 1% of the trees had enough damage where they either toppled over or their removal was warranted, and 6% had branch failure. Hurricane Irma, when it hit Tampa for this study, with 2,397 trees, this was hurricane level, like hurricane category 1 winds, so a little bit more intense. Still, 80% of the trees didn't even lose a branch that we could pick up on. 14% had branch failure, and now 7% had damage that was significant enough to warrant removal, either whole tree failure or major codominance, which we'll show you in a little bit. So, in my mind, as urban foresters and arborists, we are not, the traditional foresters are managing a forest of individuals on the ground. We are managing essentially a vertical forest, right? This is the Baranoff Oak in Safety Harbor. Every one of these stems is the size of some of those, um, you know, pines that are in that stand right there. So we have a vertical forest. We can treat each branch as its own individual because they don't help each other out, and we need to keep that in mind as we restore trees. So a little pruning basics. I'll show you the cuts we're talking about today. We're talking about removal cut and reduction cuts. A removal cut, as I mentioned before, takes a smaller branch back to a larger branch or stem. So you're kind of removing an entire branch going back to the parent. A reduction cut shortens the branch by removing the bigger stem, the main stem, back to a smaller lateral, right? So small to big, big to small. And then a heading cut, which is kind of a swear word in arboriculture, a topping cut. This is actually going to be one of our go-tos. Um, when you're topping a tree to make it smaller, you are cutting in between growth points. It's an internodal cut. You're not going back to a lateral. And the reason we're doing this after a storm is because often we don't have a lateral to go to, right? So now we're doing the best of what we can, hoping that we'll create some epicormic shoots that we can manage in the future. So, and if it's, you either clean up a wound that's maybe 4 or 6 inches and with a topping cut, or you go back to the parent stem and create an 8 or a 10-inch wound. You're doing less damage by doing a heading cut. So, knowing when to restore. We're going to talk the next couple slides. We're going to talk about how to assess damage before deciding what to do with the tree. We're going to learn which trees should be restored and which should be removed. And here's a website. I'm not sure if this link's completely up or running, but you will have a copy to this website or to this recording, so you will have access to what we're talking about right here. So, trees that you want to remove will be trees where the main trunk is cracked or broken. So, if you have your main stem going down to the ground and there is a crack or a break in there, chances are that tree will never gain the structural stability it needs to keep its canopy up for the next storm. On the same point, if you had, that one tree where we saw the three codominant stems and one broke out, if you have a large codominant stem, maybe a half or a third of the canopy that just rips out because, it was weakly attached and just succumbed to the winds, you may want to consider removing that tree as well. Trees that are leaning and that lean is towards a target, right? When you have a lean, when you have a tree that was formerly up and down, kind of going this way, we know that it has not corrected yet, and if there's no target, you can let it go and see if it does correct. But if there is a target, we need to remove it, right? Um, and then if the tree's likely to fail again, so often, like I showed you, like when there's a tree that was in a group, and it was maybe there's a lean in it because it did kind of blow over partially, but it also lost its neighbors. Now that tree is no longer, again, it's compromised because it's got a lean, but also is even more compromised because all of the surrounding barrier trees that were blocking the wind are gone. So it's going to be exposed to even more extreme winds next time with its compromised root system. So it's a compounding effect. Just take it out, right? If major roots were severed or broken, um, that is another consideration. And then trees with many large limbs missing, large limbs being anything greater than 8 inches, or trees of existing root disorders. So maybe you had a tree with a stem girdling root. It was just starting to flag, but it was not dead yet. This could be the time to just see the future of that tree, see where it was going to go. It was gonna, it was never going to be the 100-year-old oak that you wanted. And now it's a good chance, given the damage it has, to just remove it and start over with some better quality nursery stock. Trees that you can retain are young trees, even if they have more sustained damage, because these trees. And I'm sorry, I've been traveling a lot, and I have not been sleeping a lot, so my apologies for yawning. So young trees are just way more plastic and way more able to account for damage and regrow than bigger trees. Often we see this when we transplant smaller nursery stock as balled and burlap trees. The smaller stock will recover from that root loss way faster than the larger stock, in part because they lose less roots, but also because they're much more plastic, right? Defoliated trees. I was talking in Wisconsin, like up there, it's not anything to see it like the whole forest defoliate like in the winter season, right? But for a lot of us with our evergreens, it's odd to see that, and it's a very visible sign of damage. But foliage is of among the most disposable of plant tissues, where trees often will just lose their canopy for many reasons, drought, winter, other things, but they have the stored energy and when the spring comes again, to refoliate. So no need to worry. Even though it's highly visible damage, they will recover. Trees with missing dead twigs, less than 4 inches. Decay-resistant trees like live oak, even if they had major branch breakage, and then small leaning trees or recently planted trees where you can right them easily. These are all things to retain. How long does restoration take? A tree requires 2 to 5 years or more to be restored, depending on various factors. This can be the size of the tree. Smaller trees take less time to recover, as I said before. The species, decay-resistant trees will recover better. Age, mature trees will recover more time and maintenance. And then the amount of damage, of course, more intense damage equals more time and visits to help the tree recover. Restoration pruning. After a hurricane, there's two things you need to do. Develop the restoration plan and then implement it over like the multi-year period that you plan out for. Could be a few like 3 years to 5 years, depending on what you're looking at. So that plan has both the immediate response and then the follow up. So that Immediate response following a storm is to remove potential tree risks. That could be any tree that is leaning over property or roadways, things like that. Stake fallen trees where possible, and because if their roots are exposed and could dry out, the clock is ticking to get them back in the soil, and then clean canopies of damaged trees, of broken and hanging branches, things like that. Before the next visit, so these are the things you do immediately after the storm, but then you're going to be coming back for the long-term um, care of the tree. And what we're going to do is allow the tree to regenerate its energy reserves. And how do we do that, right? Well, we just don't touch it. We don't prune it. Pruning's a wound, right? Removing live canopy from a tree is removing its ability to photosynthesize when already has a compromised canopy, right? And so we're letting this thing resprout, regrow, and then we're developing a tree management program in the community in the interim that we're going to follow based on what we saw. So that immediate response, we're going to remove all tree risks that are unacceptable. That would be a fallen tree or branch in your power lines. And please, if you're doing this, make sure you know what you're doing and you know that the power lines are not active, because the number one cause of death among the arboricultural industry in Florida is just getting caught up in power lines with pruning stuff or working on trees that are power lines. So if this is not something that you are comfortable doing, you don't have the training for it, and there's EHAP training and other things, just refer them to someone else, right? Because you don't need to become a statistic because you want to help out something when it's beyond your expertise at the moment. You can gain that expertise, but if you don't have it now, don't deal with these. Instead, focus on broken, cracked, and hanging limbs near properties and large fallen trees blocking traffic areas. And again, there's a special skill to working with down trees because their limbs are under tension and loading in ways that are much different than when they're suspended in the air and gravity is the only thing pulling on them. So, this takes training as well. So, work with seasoned professionals in your business to gain the skills you need to work with fallen trees. Uh, Everyone can work on this, right? So, we're cleaning up the we're cleaning up the immediate risks, and then now we're looking at the trees that are at risk. And these are the trees that are will die if we do not help them get their roots back in the soil. So these would be small trees that are approximately 4 inches or less, and recently planted trees. What we're doing is we are writing them something like this. Honestly, that's windswept like this. It's probably fine from a health perspective, from a getting the tree upright and back where we want it, not in the traffic. That is something we want to correct. Maybe as a second tier. But like, if this had roots that were pulled out of the ground, we would want to get on that right away. We do not want the roots to dry out. Water and cover them up with a tarp or other tarp covering until the tree can be replanted. If you can't do it right away, how to stand up a tree? We want to keep the roots moist. Often the hurricane dumps a lot of rain, but then it's gone and it may not rain again right away. So be aware of that. We keep the roots moist if needed. We excavate the hole to accommodate the roots. So, maybe the tree fell to the right here and the hole kind of caved in and washed in with the rain. So now you have to remove all that fill just so you can move it back. You can use sharp hand tools to make clean cuts on jagged or torn roots um, to reduce the area of damaged root that will resprout. You can pull the tree up and as straight as possible and then fill the hole with soil from the site. How to stand up a tree? Everyone down here is well familiar with this method of staking a tree. We're gonna before we even stake though, we're gonna water the tree as if it was just recently planted, which is to irrigate 3 times a week with 3 gallons per inch of trunk diameter. Uh, there's no need to fertilize at this time. Most of our trees are the least fertilizing, like have the lowest fertilizer demand of all the, plants on the property anyways. But, if they have a compromised root system and you use something that even has like it by accident has like a high salt index or something like that, you could water stress a tree when it's already being compromised because of its root system. But back to these staking, this is something we're well familiar with. Two by fours where the two by four is kind of going up like this, and we have blocks to brace against with straps. These are perfectly fine. Mostly we use these for palms, but you can use them for trees, but you have to be diligent and make sure that you're not girdling the tree. These need to be loosened during the active growing season. Probably, an alternative that doesn't have the drawbacks of this, but is actually even stronger. This is something Ed studied with a student a couple years ago, where these look like one by ones, where they just kind of, put a stake here, pound it in, right? And then they create a staple going across the root system with untreated one by one pine. Then you put this in and then you cover it up and it'll actually rot away. And it is the strongest connection that they tested when they looked at um, typical poles of guy wires, two by fours, and this was the strongest one in static pole testing. And it gives the tree the ability to generate taper because the whole trunk and canopy is free moving. The roots are the only thing that are secured. So the whole trunk has the ability to create some motion in a controlled way, which allows it to create taper, which trees need to resist the next storm. Immediately following the storm, step three, we want to clean tree canopies by removing dead, cracked, and broken limbs. We can make small, smooth pruning cuts if you want. The British like to make what we call cornet cuts, which are they're jagged cuts that resemble broken branches. You already have enough of those in there. You can do it if you want, but I think, like for all the good I hear about them, it seems to be mostly an aesthetic thing, honestly. I haven't seen any research on it yet, but that's something that I'm going to be looking in the future. So for now, the recommendation from us is to make smooth pruning cuts, remove hanging branches first, starting at the top of the canopy and working your way down just because you don't want to get hit by stuff as you're moving around. So, uh, so it's kind of I kind of reconciled some of my slides with this, so we're kind of talking about removal cuts again. Again, this is a cut that goes, from a small back to a big branch. What it looks like on the tree itself is, maybe removing an entire codominant branch right here, right? This is a very drastic way of um, changing the form of a tree. Something that would probably be best reserved for only really small specimens where that codominant branch isn't too big on the trunk. Reduction cuts, in contrast, this would be my go-to, honestly. Instead of removing this whole branch right here, we go to this lateral right here. We've now picked this branch to be the loser. By removing all this photosynthetic material, it's the same as shading it out, right? And then this thing will just kind of stop growing, and the rest of the tree will continue to grow in size. And eventually, this branch will be much smaller than it is right now in comparison to the trunk. It'll be a much less drastic removal when you eventually do take it back to the stem. And then heading cuts. These are, I mean, if you're training a tree, you're not doing this, but again, these are a tool to use when the tree itself has been topped by the wind, right? So if these branches have been broken and there wasn't a good lateral to go to, you could do a heading cut. But what you're really probably going to use heading cuts for are trees that were branches that were kind of shaded and had just a little bit of foliage way out, and now they're sun exposed because the canopy is completely changed. But that little tuft of foliage is gone, and there's no laterals to go back to, right? Um, Example of canopy cleaning, it's starting to look, it looks better. A lot of reduction cuts here, like going back to this lateral here, this lateral here, this lateral here. So, nothing drastic. We still have a lot of work to do to balance this crown, but at this point, we've removed the obvious hazards and we're going to let the tree sprout and grow back. Again, we're not topping trees, so even if you are using heading cuts, the act of topping a tree is the intentional just reduction in height of a tree without any regard for biology, right? These trees were not wind damaged. These trees were human damaged. Someone wanted them smaller, and someone knew how to use a chainsaw, and that's about it. Honestly, they had no regard for the form of a tree, its natural defense zones, and the damage is horrendous. Live oak and crepe myrtle, they'll survive it, but our goal is um, not to have our trees survive despite our best efforts. We want them to thrive because of our efforts, right? So, and again, if the tree's topped by the wind, that wasn't us. Now we're just working with it the best we can, right? So immediately following the storm, again, our response plan was to remove potential hazards, stake fallen trees where possible, and clean canopies of damaged trees. Before our next visit, we are doing nothing. We're just letting the tree regrow its canopy and its energy reserves, and we're developing our plan based on the damage we saw on the property or across the HOA or within the community we're working with. Allow time for sprouting so that the trees can regenerate energy reserves. Um, you know, these oaks were heavily damaged. They look dead, right? But if you scratch beneath the surface of a smaller branch, you'd see living cambium, green cambium. We know they're alive now. Just give them until the next spring to grow out, and then we can see what we have to work with, right? Maybe until that point, we don't know if thing is entirely dead, if it's partially dead, or if it's entirely alive and ready to work with. So, these things look completely dead here, but come back a few months later, and now we can see, okay, this tree's toast, right? But there's stuff to work with in both of these trees. This one's almost completely alive. This one has one branch that is probably going to need to be removed. So trees should begin sprouting by the spring of the year following a hurricane. That would be April for our hardiness zones. And you wait for the sprout growth to slow before you start actually pruning, right? Um, Pines do not sprout. So if you have a pine that is completely denuded or completely brown with its foliage, aside from pitch pine, which does sprout, it will not recover. So you can just remove those without waiting. So when you're developing your tree management plan, you're gonna either work with the homeowner if that's your client, or the HOA board, or if you're the urban forester, you're just doing it yourself, probably, with maybe city council, whoever, um, or public works. But you're gonna work to create a tree management program that has routine visits, and then you're gonna use regular pruning to rebuild the structure of the tree and minimize failure in future storms. So we covered the initial response. We're creating the plan, and now we're going to implement the restoration program. Again, that program is going to vary by tree size. Large maturing trees versus small, ornamentals versus shade. It's gonna vary by age, which you can estimate based on trunk diameter compared to what is typical for a mature species. That's not always a great comparison because trees can be stunted for many years, but it's usually a decent proxy, right? Species, I mean, it's good to know what species are prone to decay and have a poor growth habit, and that changes too, given the life phases. I read in one of Gilman's books that you know Magnolia was a poor compartmentalizer, so we used it for a project, but In all honesty, when they're young, like the ones we're using for our project, those things are solid compartmentalizers. So their ability to compartmentalize must not hold up as they age, right? It must be age dependent because we did some pretty massive wounding to some young magnolia, and they did just fine, right? And then the amount of damage, what percentage of the canopy is damaged? So what's a pruning program look like for large maturing trees? When they're young, it can be 2 to 4 years with 3 visits. But as they get older, that's stretching to 3 to 5 years and 3 to 5 visits, or even more as you get to mature trees that are over 20 inches in diameter. Compare that to your ornamental trees, like maybe like a tababuya or what would be a small ornamental. John, help me out here. Anyways, like a small, just I was gonna say something like Japanese maple because I was just in Wisconsin. Smaller trees like that. It's probably just gonna be a smaller window, 2 to 3 years, 2 visits for a young one, and then maybe maxing out at 4 visits for a larger, mature, or small stature tree. If that makes sense. Trees that resist decay. Think of things like live oak, mahogany, gumbo limbo, tamarind, and then these are the ones that we just know from working with them as mature specimens. That laurel oak, Royal Poinciana, ficus, orchid tend to be poor compartmentalizers as they age. A good compartmentalizer can handle some pretty aggressive pruning. So this was a pretty big reduction cut right here on a live oak, and you can see here that even though this was a pretty large cut, the branch protection zone has remained fairly intact. That triangular zone of kind of compartmentalization that keeps decay from spreading further along into the parent stem. So, in contrast, red maple, not a great compartmentalizer, not a great tree for Florida unless it's by water. There's actually some native ones that are just in a swampy area by me at work that look great, but um, so the same size wound. In this case, this was a removal cut, but it is a much bigger area of decay, actually making its way all the way to the pith, and then that'll transfer up and down the tree because the pith is a major pathway for discoloration and decay. So. Trees with good structure will require less pruning, believe it or not. So things like bald cypress, sweet gum, young southern magnolia, things that are those are excurrent trees. Those would do fine. Live oak just tends to have a good spacing of its branches naturally. So again, less work right there. Compare that to mahogany, red maple, pecan, laurel oak. Those will probably use a little bit more care to um, get them back to where we want them. This is the strongest shape that we can hope for in an urban environment. So and this is natural in a bald cypress. We work towards this when we prune trees. This is a weaker form right here. I will say though that my research recently, if you see, if we want to strive for this, but when we have trees that have gotten away from us and do have codominance and things like this, these are the rare instances, right? These they do break, but every branch can break in a tree. And I wouldn't do anything drastic with pruning. I wouldn't over prune or make big cuts to get to this shape if it's gotten past that point. Ideal shape, but if that hasn't happened, don't do anything drastic to get this into this form right here. The amount of damage if you have 30% canopy damage, you probably can make it back in a year and actually start doing some work. If you have more than 50% canopy damage, you might want to set it and forget it for a year or two and then make your decision then, right? Monitor it carefully over that 2 year period and decide whether the tree is actually declining or recovering. I had a arborist from the state of Cudahy in the Milwaukee area say like, I know the clear cut cases when it comes to risk assessment. I know like the things that are gonna make it and are completely sound, the things we gotta remove right away. But there's a whole lot of stuff in the middle that is, you know, a gray area, and I'd say that's the majority of trees that we risk assess that have elevated risk are in a gray area, right? So as arborists, we need to get comfortable just giving them time, and if just stopping for like 10, 20 minutes and making a decision on a tree, um, that's not a lot of data, right? If you look at it and then you look at it 6 months, a year later, and you can see whether or not the tree is getting better or worse, that's two data points that will tell you the trajectory of the tree. And please, please, please don't be afraid to just say we have to monitor this. We don't need to make a decision right now. It's not coming down, but we don't want to like just say cut it down or restore it without knowing whether or not that's the right decision. So, restoration pruning. The first visit would be sprout management, and we're going to talk about the reduce some, remove some, and leave some approach. The second and third visits will be establishing new leaders and continue to manage the sprouts to get the shape we want. And then afterwards, after like the fourth and fifth kind of a pruning cycle, we're going to be doing preventative pruning to continue to manage codominant stems and make sure that the stems that we picked as the winners continue to thrive and are the ones that are growing in the direction we want them to. So when you have a broken end like this, or you cut this, if you cut this thing clean right here, you're going to have in many species dormant buds break underneath the surface of the bark. And these epicormic shoots are going to release because they're now exposed to sun. And you're going to let these things just do their thing. And you're going to watch them and you're going to manage them. Over time, those leaves will develop into woody stems that can grow into strong lateral branches. I have a live oak in my park across the street from my house here, where its entire canopy must have got broken out because every single branch in the upper canopy is going straight up, and they're a former epicormic branch, and they're like 8 inches in diameter, and that thing took Milton like a champ, right? So but it and I don't think that thing had any care. But we can speed things along and make them even stronger by helping out and picking and spacing these things out. And I'll show you how that right now. So there's the reduce some, remove some, and leave some approach that Gilman suggests. Anytime you see a third, a third, a third, know that that's a rule of thumb. There, that shows that um, it's probably just the someone's best guess, and we are actually working on research now to see if these numbers hold up, and they might. But it is our best guess at the moment, and I think there's some sound reasoning behind it. So let's go with this. So the first thing you're gonna do is shorten a third of the sprouts. They will continue to have photosynthetic. They'll have leaves, so they'll keep photosynthesizing, right? But we're gonna eventually remove them. We're gonna remove a third of the sprouts that are just too close to other sprouts, and maybe they're a little bit shaded out already and a little spindly. So we're gonna give the other ones room to grow, and then we're gonna take the ones that are growing in the directions we want, the strongest ones, and things like that to develop new branches. So in this case, this was the sprout on a horizontal branch. We saw that here you have a codominant stem right here that's going to form if we don't do anything about it. So we're going to reduce this one here so that this one can become the dominant branch in this fork. This branch right here was really close to this one, which we want to keep. So we're going to remove it. Again, we want to reduce this one in here so that this one that we're keeping has more space. And then we have, more potentials for codominance to form at this end. So we're going to be removing that. This is a downward facing one that we really don't want it to grow down to the ground, especially since it's coming right out from the same point as this branch right here, so we're removing it. We are thinning it out, picking the winners and losers, and working with what we have here. And a more vertical sprout, you can see here, this again was a fork that could have become codominant, so we reduced some. Same here, directing growth away from this sprout right here, which is going to be our new kind of leader. Removing competing branches around sprouts around it, and then again focusing growth away from that leader as well, and making sure that this was the tallest, strongest one, because this is the one that we want to continue the branch upward and eventually enclose that wound. So reduce some, remove some, leave some. We can see what that looks like. We have these big witches brooms here. We are going to work with them to reduce them and clean them up. Nothing too drastic at this point. You can see we're removing about a third of the canopy, but we're still leaving plenty of material for the tree to recover. After that first restoration, the tree, you can see there is some sprouts here. It still looks like it has been topped, but it will eventually, as these things grow, gain more of that graceful form that we hope to see in our large mature shade trees. So again, 1 to 2 years, we're going to do the reduce, remove, and leave some approach, but now we're going to moving on to establishing a new leader at the ends of a broken stem through continued sprout management. So we're going to establish that new leader during the canopy cleaning. We're going to make pruning cuts on limbs. If there's a broken limb, we can clean it up right here. We're going to let the branches sprout, and we're going to do the thinning and reducing as we mentioned before. And you're going to look for a sprout to be the new leader. If you want one here at the end, because it'll kind of enclose over that wound. And then other sprouts that you really want to keep are ones that are, further down, that are actually forming a collar. These things are strong. We were doing some sprout breaking about a month ago, and something like this where it's starting to kind of engulf the top. It's still really relatively easy to break. I'm not gonna lie, but when we got to these sprouts right here, they were maxing out our 2,000 pound wedge, right? And I have like the Branch Breaker 2000, which is this big wooden torture machine I created. And something like this that was small but had a really strong collar was surprised at us at how much it made our system struggle to break it apart. So you can see here the collar is already forming on this tree right here, and that is something to look for. It's the same branch collar we see on else in trees that haven't been damaged and is extremely strong. But we do want that new leader to establish to close over um, the broken end. New leaders can seal over damaged tips and stems that are 4 inches or less in diameter. Larger stems, which that must be a typo, um, may take more time in sprout management to recover. So. This can be done. You can establish new leaders in even small trees. So this is one that was recently planted, and the entire top broke out, maybe because it was smashed by a branch or something like that. You can see here the person who took the pictures chose to just remove that entire break off, knowing that this would always be problematic. And then this lateral here will be our new leader. Since it is a green branch, they were able to bend it upward and then tie it with landscape or nursery ties to a rod. And voila, you have an instant new leader on this tree. That over time, that as that wood lignifies and it thickens, it will stay in an upright position, right? So 8 months later, we have that tree went to this, right? Because it's amazing what you can do to a young tree. I mean, in the nursery, they'll take a 2 inch diameter tree, cut off its entire top, leave like 3 inches at the base, put a brand like a bud from a cultivar they want to clone, and within a year they have a 7 foot tree, right? Because that root system is just pumping out energy into that branch. Well, this tree had an entire established root system. Let's take advantage of that established root system that it has in the landscape and work with it and look at the bounce back and the growth 8 months later. You can see here the branch that they tied up is woody now. It's brown, but we also have a sprout right next to it that's even straighter, and it's green, and it's just as big. So maybe that's the one we want to work with now, right? So you can see here, they ended up deciding to remove everything but that new sprout, and that took over as the new layer. So then later visits, we're gonna do preventative pruning to reduce and remove codominant stems, and so continue the process as you would with normal tree training, and there you go. Things to avoid. If anyone's a sailor in the group, when we talk about making trees, right here we talk about making trees stronger for the next storm, right? One of the things we talk about is reducing canopy often, as a means of, especially trees that have a compromised root system. And if you've ever sailed and you've ever been in a boat that's in wind that's a little bit too fierce for the vessel, where it's not comfortable anymore. One of the things you can do as a sailor is what we call reef the sail, where you just take the sail and you slide it down the mast and you reef it down here. You kind of wrap it around here, tie it, and you have a smaller sail, so that it can handle the increased wind power. Even though you have a smaller sail area, you're still cruising because it's under a lot of wind load. Well, we often talk about reducing tree canopy to get that same kind of effect, this by reducing sail area, but unfortunately, getting out to the ends of branches is really hard. So people often will do what we call lines tailing, where they get into the interior of the tree and they have a pole saw or they have a ladder or whatever, and they are just getting whatever they can reach below it, and they're raising the canopy up. This is problematic because when we talk about wind loading, when you have a canopy that goes, say where this used to be, like right here, the wind load is concentrated in the center point of the mass of that canopy. So when you can see my mouse, I believe, right? So if it's going right here, then the load is centered at the midpoint right here. The moment you move the canopy upward, you're forcing that midpoint higher up, and now the wind load is higher up, and it's a lot more lever arm, a bigger moment to push against, and that's more detrimental to the tree actually. Not only that, but you've thinned out all these branches, and look at how spindly that growth is. Those interior branches give girth, they give increased diameter as they grow. And so we forced the load higher up, and now there's more spindly branches. And we're also reducing what we call um, mass dampening. So having internal branches having a lot of weight in the canopy helps the tree to resist the flow of wind, right? So when you have the wind push, not every branch, in the case where Ed's got a turboprop engine on it, yes, all the branches go in one direction, right? But most trees, especially trees of codominance like this, as the outer ones are going in, there could be a bounce back, and the branches can, crash into each other and kind of distribute it, like kind of diffuse that loading through what we call mass dampening. We use this in towers a lot. This is the Taipei Tower. Someone wanted a ginormous tower that totally did not fit into the landscape in Taiwan. They made it huge. Things completely exposed to the wind. Instead of making this thing just a giant concrete column, they made it with steel, which is much lighter, but they put a mass dampener in the top. And as the wind pushes this thing, say to the right, this big free floating ball that's filled with water and has a lot of weight will swing to the left, and it cancels out the force of the wind. And that's what branches do at a micro scale. Leaves do this too. And, removing those interior branches through line scaling is detrimental to the tree and its health. So, again, we're not topping. And I mean, if you're going to top, at least do it right. This guy didn't even get that right there. It's not even even. So it offends me in two different ways, honestly. So, but anyways, with that, thank you very much for your time. And I went long today. Sorry, I was really chatty.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Yeah, if anyone, I mean, this is all going to be recorded, and we'll be able to send that to everyone afterwards. I'm going to go ahead and put a survey in the chat, but I mean, if I don't know, if we'll try and keep Q&A really short here, but if you do have a question for Andrew, go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly, or go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll try and get to that.
Hey, I got a delivery. I gotta do. I'm gonna be gone for like 1 minute, okay, or it's 30 seconds.
Okay, yeah, we'll hang out. We'll hang tight here for a second, and let me go ahead and just put this in our chat here. Well, let me go ahead and ask something to everybody that is here. That did that seem comprehensive, or was there anything like that that might uh based off of your experiences, like that potentially can be addressed with regard to the material covered, I guess, like post hurricane, post storm stuff that you would want to see more material on in the future? Okay, I've got something here. I'll go ahead and save it for Andrew. Yeah, sprout management. Yeah, I think I've been seeing some things out there that, like, the folks that have been going through PPQ training, um, they've been trying to tell people that, like, sprouts are your friends, and kind of trying to get folks on board with, like, realizing that there is a lot of benefits to keeping them. And I feel like that there is a lot in the past that kind of emphasize them being kind of weak, and like Andrew said, like, they can be really strong depending on where they're at. So
Yeah, and they kind of go through like a weird teenage phase where like they're just putting on growth, right? You're just doing like is they're getting as much growth as possible to get the canopy going again. But eventually they're gonna like get multiple years of trunk growth over that to harden them up, and really make the connection strong. So
there's a question here, Andrew. When a tree has been topped year after year, and they're specifying live oak here, uh, how how should it be managed to reduce the harm?
let
I
me
know
see
this
one.
is kind of getting out of storms. This is just repeated topping, I
So
guess.
yeah, I mean it's the same thing. So topping by wind, topping by an ill-informed arborist, everything you saw here is applicable, right? I mean, you would hopefully stop the future harm from occurring, like I don't know. Get a pamphlet. We have pamphlets we can hand out or something. But yeah, sorry, Beth. Yeah, but it is the exact same thing that you saw, whether it's a hurricane or a human.
Yeah, there's a comment here from
They
Michelle
live in.
Cohen. So
Okay.
yeah, I'll go ahead and read it off here. I live in zone 6 as well, and those practices are also good for me. I generally, after a storm, let the trees show me where to prune, unless stated that danger from the same branching. I like the wishing broom concept, or just thinning out and then reevaluate.
Hmm.
But yeah, so
Reduction
I guess
pruning and sprout management. Yep. Great. Well, thanks
awesome.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So yeah, if you can just go ahead and fill out that survey, we deeply appreciate it. And I'll follow up with another one in 3 to 6 months. And from there, yeah, I'll follow up as well with an email with a link to the recording. And I just wanted to say thank you to Andrew for being able to fit us in during a lunch hour here and into the schedule. I mean, he's pretty busy. I mean, most of the folks that I have on, really all of them are very busy, and so it's awesome being able to be able to get all this going on during the even during a work day. So thank you, Andrew, and
Yeah,
look forward to having you on a later edition.
sounds great. Thanks for having me, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Cheers.